Well, kia ora tātou everybody, and welcome to the CMA webinar to discuss Alert Level 3 and the related issues that our businesses and their workers are facing, particularly in relation to Auckland, but obviously impacting the rest of the country. I'm Brett O'Reilly, the CEO of the EMA. It's my pleasure to be your MC today and coordinate the questions for the webinar. We're taking questions on Slido and we'll be providing those details through the webinar. Joining me today on the webinar from the EMA are our Employment Relations and Safety Manager, Paul Jarvie, and our Head of Legal, Matthew Deering. Obviously, there's a lot of moving parts in the current situation, and we've been very busy working with government and government agencies around a number of aspects. Today we're going to discuss the wage subsidy extension, which was announced yesterday, which we've been involved with providing input into, and I know we've already had a number of questions from members, so thank you for those. Secondly, we're going to be talking about the changes in sick leave provisions, and again, I know that's an issue that's of concern to many. And then we'll also talk about the current issues that we're having with the Auckland domestic border. This has been really unsatisfactory, and the anomalies between the conditions that have existed under previous alert levels and the changes as a result of the Ministry of Health order made over the weekend have really exacerbated what was already a difficult situation. Some pleasing news: we've been working with government on this, and we understand that there will be changes announced in the next 24 hours that should make that border process operate more effectively. But obviously happy to take any questions and issues that you have on today's webinar. Anything that we can feed into the process is very useful in terms of making people aware of within government around those issues. And I know it's really putting stress and strain on businesses. Our business helpline has been going flat out over the last few days. That's 0800 500 362 for those of you who have not used it to date, and if you do require further clarification on issues after today's webinar, then you're welcome to use the helpline. And obviously for today's webinar, we're taking questions on Slido, and the code in Slido is level 3, LEVEL numeral 3. So without further ado, I'll now introduce you to Paul Jarvie, and Paul will take you through some aspects of the recent announcements about the interventions available for businesses, and please keep those questions coming in on Slido. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Brett, and thanks for the introduction. As you'll be aware, there's lots going on, and as Brett said, there's lots of moving parts which we all need to understand. I think one of the basic things that we've learned over the last couple of weeks is that employment law hasn't changed. So even though the world around us has changed, employment law and employment contracts have stayed the same, and we're seeing this played out in the authority as certain cases go through, and certainly Matt will touch on that later on. But talking about sick leave and wage subsidies, Grant Robertson made it very clear when we went into 3 and with the wage subsidy announcement just recently that there should be no barriers for staff to be tested, and once they are tested, if there's any leave requirements. So from the government's perspective, they're wanting this to be quite a smooth transition because they want as many people tested as possible, given that we have a community outbreak within the Auckland region in the main. That being said, it underlines the importance of contact tracing. And if all else fails today, I think it's really important that businesses and their staff and their families really pick up the notion of doing contact tracing. Without that, we wouldn't be able to be on top of the current exercise that's going through. So going back to sick leave, everyone's got sick leave entitlement, and we well know that some parts of the population may have used up their sick leave under COVID level 4 and 3 previously. So they may well have nil balances and or in debt already. Having said that, they may then be subject to either more testing or being told by officials to go into self-quarantine. That poses a question then for the employer in terms of the person's leave and their leave balance. I just want to also reiterate that sick leave can be augmented by unused annual leave, and that's by agreement with the employee and the employer. It's their entitlement, so they have to agree to that leave. Where there is no leave balance at all, then the employer and the employee need to negotiate on how that's going to be managed going forward. And there are several options inside that space. It can be leave without pay. You can have special leave. You can have leave in advance. There's a whole variety of ways that can be that situation can be addressed. But I stress the point, absolutely, this must be by negotiation with the employee, and if need be, their representative, and you should always put that in writing. It's absolutely vital to make sure that all these are negotiated and formalised. This is to ensure that if things go belly up down the track, at least you've got some form of audit trail. Equally, we know from a different perspective within the Auckland region that employees and certainly employers are finding this time quite stressful, and that's not unsurprising. We are also getting into, if you like, COVID fatigue, where people are getting quite annoyed about it, they're getting frustrated about it, and this is part of what we call the grief cycle. And I think it's important for employers to understand that if you're going through hard and problematic times, so are your staff. And I think it's really important that as a businesses, we take time to think about our staff and try and assist them as best we can through this process. So I think the points I want to make in that space are the following. I think we need to talk with staff, not to staff, and that's a big difference. And part of talking with staff is we need to listen. And we make the point about there's a difference between hearing and listening. So listening means that you really understand where they're coming from, what are their individual issues, and why are they feeling, or what's driving their current behaviours. If you think about the whole grief cycle, people go into denial, which means it's not happening to me, it can't be happening, the world's against me. Then they go into the anger phase. Everything's wrong. Why are they picking on me? Why are you picking on me? Why are you sending me home? And then they can go into the bottom of the cycle, which is a depression, where they start to close down. They just can't see a way out. The world's becoming too problematic. I've got bills coming in. I've got sick kids. I've got employers wanting me to sign this and sign that. It's really a problematic time. From then, they start to come out of that phase into what we call acceptance. They understand what's going on, and that's where you can certainly help by listening to staff, and then they understand what the process is. And this is the change cycle, and it's really important for employers to understand that it's an absolutely normal process. You as individuals are going through it yourselves. You as businesses are going through this as well, and certainly your employees would be going through the same or similar processes. And I want to stress the point that it's not abnormal, it's absolutely normal. And as business leaders and as businesses, we need to understand where your staff are coming from and try and assist them through that journey. You can't really jump stages. You really need to go through all those stages to come out the other end. So that's finished me as far as the intro is concerned. I'll hand you over now to Matthew Deering.
Well, hello everybody. And I'd just like to reiterate Paul's initial comments, which were that a key rule to remember is that employment law hasn't changed. And I think there has been some confusion created by some of the language that's used in the government websites around, say, for example, the wage subsidy and employers using their best endeavours to pay 80%. That hasn't changed the fact that you still need agreement from your employees to modify anything in relation to their remuneration or hours of work, and that you need to ensure that any actions that you're undertaking are justified and carried out in a procedurally fair manner. So again, any variation to terms of employment, pay rate, hours of work, place of work, that type of stuff requires agreement from the employees, and it's fundamental that you get that in writing. Again, it's talking with your employees, like Paul said, and employees can lawfully decline any proposed variations. They don't have to agree, no matter how compelling the rationale that you put forward may be. Certainly in terms of if you just go ahead and make unilateral changes without the employee's express consent, they will be unlawful. And as a result, you will be exposing your business to legal risk. Just to put, I guess, some averages to you, the average cost for an employer at the moment to go to the Employment Relations Authority and win is $17,000. That's just to go there and win. The average cost for an employer to go to the authority and lose is now over $60,000. So you've got to make sure, and what I always tell my clients is process, process, process. It's crucial that you follow proper processes. If you're in a situation where you are putting forward issues around proposed variations to employment agreements to deal with whatever type of situation that your company is facing, and an employee declines a variation, you're not allowed to treat them adversely. So there's no way you can't somehow treat them differently from everybody else just because they've declined your request. And doing so will constitute an unjustified disadvantage claim. So again, you know, employers are in a very tough position. Not only are you trying to run your business and doing your daily work, you've got the impacts of COVID, you're trying to deal with the new restrictions, but staff who are not, for lack of a better term, playing ball and agreeing with proposed variations based on sound rationale can be very difficult. Ultimately, potentially, if employees decline the variations, you may need to look at restructuring and redundancies. And of course, again, you're going to have to follow a full and fair process during that period of time. Of course, EMA is here to help. We have produced a new range of templates and step-by-step guides for you, not only for proposing variations to employees, and it has the templates, and you can choose the different types of variations that you want to make, whether that be hours of work or pay. But also we have a HR toolkit for restructuring and redundancy, which again has that step-by-step guide to ensure that you're legally compliant, and also all the template letters from the announcement to the proposal, undertaking consultation, and then confirming whatever it is in terms of changes that you're proposing to do. What I would say is that it's a bit of a moving landscape at the moment, and the rules are changing as we go from week to week. So it is a bit of tread carefully and just make sure that we're up to date with what it is in terms of the government's proposals and offers that you can take advantage of. Another thing I would say is we've had some recent case law come out of the authority from the recent or from the previous lockdown, and they have been weighted heavily in favour of the employees, and that is that you simply can't, as an employer, go and change people's wages, and if they can't work or you're locked down, what kind of rules are implemented. And that will flow through with different cases over time, because that's only relatively recently. But what I can say is that the law has not changed, and simply because you receive the wage subsidy or you're in a difficult financial position, you must get agreement from your employees for any types of changes that you're seeking to implement, and the restructure rules are still in place. So again, it's really important to have a proper business case, rationale, and follow a proper process around consultation with employees. It can be truncated in this period of time, so it can be a bit shorter than otherwise it may have been in the past. So you can probably undertake a restructure a lot quicker than you could have previously. But again, you've got to follow those fundamental steps to ensure that you're acting in a procedurally fair manner. So that's it from me, and I guess we can take some questions from here, because I know there's lots of questions out there that you guys want to answer.
Thanks, Matt. Really good summary of where we're at, and thank you also, Paul, for your summary. Look, we've got some great questions coming in on Slido, so I'll pitch the first of those, and I might start with you, Matt. Can employers add a new employee after they've already applied for and been granted a wage subsidy?
My view is yes, you can. You just have to reapply for that particular employee. So it's the employer's obligation to choose specific employees that they wish to get the wage subsidy for. Again, you're going to need consent from that employee to make the application, because you're disclosing confidential information about them, their pay rates, that type of stuff, IRD number. So if you talk with a new employee and yeah, obviously get their consent to make that application, then you would be able to, for the up to the end of the duration of your wage subsidy period.
Thanks, Matt. And I think following on from that, a question, this employer has previously received the wage subsidy and subsidy extension. If eligible, can we apply for the resurgent subsidy once we finish paying the extension to our employees?
Yes, but not until your current subsidy runs out. So with respect to the resurgent subsidy, applications can be made from 21 August to 3 September, and your 2-week payment will run from the date that you applied.
And another question, if we do receive the resurgence wage subsidy, is it only applicable to the employees currently experiencing a drop in income, or to all employees in our business?
The criteria applies to the business rather than the employees. So, but once you're eligible as a business, you don't need, you can claim the wage subsidy for employees who are relatively affected. So I guess the answer to the question is it doesn't apply to, you know, it's not only applicable to employees, it's the employer who actually applies for it. So in our view, if you do receive the resurgence wage subsidy, it's only applicable to a drop in income or business. Was that the question? Sorry, I was just running. Could you repeat the question? Sorry.
The question was, did the wage subsidy have to be, could it be restricted to those employees who are impacted by the resurgence?
Oh, right. Yes, no, it's for the entire business. Yeah, so it's not just it's about the employer. It's not about restricted to employees. It's about the employer. So it applies to all your employees within the business that meets that criteria. Yeah.
Cool. Now here's a trickier one. So let me just work through this. We're a business that had 6 staff off getting COVID tests last week. We have not had the 30 to 40% drop in income, but staff have not got sick leave and are using their annual leave. Are we eligible for the sick leave subsidy due to COVID to help our employees?
Yes, the sick leave subsidy is still available. However, you're going to have to meet certain criteria, and it's actually what they call a leave subsidy, and it used to be called the Essential Workers Leave Support Subsidy, and they've changed that. They've expanded it out past just essential workers and are providing it for all employers. But there are some pretty specific criteria that they would need to meet, and that is that the employee cannot work because they're at a higher risk of getting COVID under the Ministry of Health guidelines. they have come into contact with someone who has COVID-19 and must self-isolate, they've tested positive themselves, or have household members that are at a higher risk if they get COVID-19. And so that you have to meet those certain criteria for the leave payment. Simply going off and getting a test probably will not meet those criteria. And you also have to have conversations with your employees. You need some evidence per se from the employee if you're going to apply for the leave subsidy, and that's around discussing that you're going to make an application. So you get their consent to make their application, because again, you're going to be disclosing confidential information, and also agree with them that they fall into one of the eligibility groups, and those groups are available on, and that information is available on EMA's COVID-19 website.
And Matt, presumably those criteria are to avoid a situation where staff decide they don't want to come to work and want to get sick leave paid to them, regardless of whether they've actually had potential exposure to COVID-19.
Yeah, and so you might have a situation, say under the Ministry of Health guidelines, where someone has asthma, and therefore they would be at a higher risk if they get COVID-19 of potentially having more severe consequences. So again, you'd go through that process, get that information from the employee if they're going to take up that leave subsidy. Again, what I would say is you can't simply just pay on the leave subsidy. You would have to talk to them about their existing leave, their sick leave, and also, I mean, if they've run out of leave, you're still going to have to top up to normal wages unless you get an agreed variation to their terms and conditions of employment. So you simply can't just pay them on the subsidy.
Thanks, Matt. Paul, anything to add on that subject?
Yeah, I think we saw during lockdown the whole question about vulnerable workers, and there is a population of people out there who are deemed to be vulnerable from the health authorities, or themselves they feel vulnerable for a whole variety of reasons. And we did hear through the previous episodes of 4.3 down to 1 that some people were choosing to stay away from work even when it was deemed that there was no communicable diseases, it was safe to return to work. In those situations, then I think employers do need to be on the front foot of that and really make it clear that as far as the authorities are concerned, as far as work's concerned, it is safe to return to work. If the employee chooses then to stay away from work, then that is a different situation entirely. And again, consultation and negotiation with your employee is absolutely vital, following all formal procedures. Underlying all that, it's important to really understand from the employee's perspective what's driving their behaviour and try and address that rather than just address the person who's saying that they don't want to come back to work.
Thanks, Paul. Look, I've got a couple of questions here which are around are other employers exercising discretion to allow employees to use their sick leave for self-isolation even when they are not symptomatic? So I think it's picking up the point you've just talked about. What are we hearing, Matt and Paul, in terms of how employers are dealing with the situation?
Well, I think from just our perspective, if someone is seeking sick leave, again, it's working with that person. And if, you could take two tracks. One is, request them to get a medical certificate, which you're entitled to do if they want to take off leave. No doubt they would get that. The other one is to say, well, if you're going to use your sick leave, well, you're going to use your sick leave and you're not going to have any left. So the employee just needs to be aware of that and get that request in writing. Paul, your comment?
Yeah, look, I think it's important to understand that sick leave is their entitlement. There's certain criteria that need to be met for that exercise, for that entitlement to be exercised. Certainly, there is still some ambiguity about the person who wants to self-isolate themselves or have been told to self-isolate by the authorities. And arguably, there are two different situations. But again, I think it's coming back to basic principles. If there's leave entitlement there, then you can be used. If they're being sent home, arguably then the employer has got work for them, the employee can still work. Some other authority is sending them home. So you need to negotiate how that's going to be worked through.
Yeah, and I think just picking up on that point, if the Ministry of Health or what have you, I mean, if they're COVID positive, obviously, then they're potentially sick. But if someone says that they want to self-isolate because they've got a sniffle or a cough or what have you, you probably don't want them at work anyway, because it's going to scare the rest of the employees. And we have been dealing with a few situations where people have tried to battle on and come into work and they've been sent home because they're coughing and sneezing. And now they're saying, well, I haven't asked for sick leave, you sent me home, you have to pay me, and I can't work from home. So you get those types of situations as well, which can be quite tricky.
I think the important thing, just to kind of encapsulate all that, is every case is quite different, and you really need to get your full set of facts before you start making any decisions. And I'd certainly encourage you to call our advice line just to get some objective third-party advice as to how you manage those.
Thanks, team. Got a couple more here. Matt, here's a hot potato for you. In regards to varying terms and conditions, a number of lawyers, I might add none of these from the EMA, both online and in the news, publicly advised employers that because the employees were not able to attend work, they could then not pay them. This was disappointing, and I wondered if employers who took this advice in good faith had any recourse.
Well, you can always complain to the Law Society if you think the advice was crooked. But look, I think there's a divergence of views, and it is a very grey area. This is something that we haven't really dealt with before. We've had swine flu, bird flu, other pandemics, but they haven't been to the extent that we've had COVID-19. So I guess where there's a situation where someone's, at home and can't work from home and the business is closed, therefore, if they're still willing and able to work, the recent authority case that just came out 2 weeks ago says the employer still has to pay. And so you'd have to undertake a restructure really quickly to deal with that. Our view is take the safest line until the courts have come through. That authority decision has been appealed, and that's been given urgency. So it's working its way up the track, and a judge may have a different view to the authority member around whether the person's actually able to work. And I think that those are those kind of key definitions which will have to be explored by someone higher up the chain to give some certainty, because I guess we all want certainty, because we don't want to be providing advice that's incorrect. But at this stage, like with any legal issue, there's always litigation risk. There's risk as to whether it's right or wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, probably goes without saying, but one of the advantages of dealing with our legal team is we're dealing with these issues all the time. And so, we can, Matt and the team basically are able to look across, such a wide range of cases, working in with other lawyers in the Business New Zealand network, so we can actually see what's happening. So that is one of the advantages that we have of, I guess, having a much wider viewpoint around that. What
I would say is if you get 2 lawyers in a room, you're going to get 3 opinions. So, it's one of those things.
Thanks, Matt. And probably, Paul, one for you. If we choose not to apply for the wage subsidy because we are still profitable, can we still require those at risk to use their own leave? I think we know the answer to this, but I think it's worth clarifying it.
Yeah, look, it's their leave, and the law under the Holidays Act has certain requirements for them to meet. I would suggest that you'd need some medical evidence for you to start asking for that leave to be taken. And again, I think it's by negotiation, but the law is the law, and that hasn't changed just because it's COVID.
Yeah, and I think with requiring people to take leave, maybe they have high leave balances. There's other ways of looking at it. But if you can't agree on an employee taking leave, you have to give them 14 days notice if you're going to require them to take annual leave, and you have to have a reasonable basis for doing so, not just, I guess, guessing and assumptions.
And Matt, can an employer just pay their employee the wage subsidy amount, even if they're working full-time?
No. Oh, well, by agreement you can. So that's where it's really important. We've got these practice kits with the variation templates and all these products for you. You have to get it in writing. So I'd be cautious about getting verbal agreement for somebody, because that can always come back to haunt you. And very important to get any variation agreed upon. Yeah, but yes, you can agree to anything you like, as long as it's not less than the minimum wage for the hour. Yeah.
And Matt, following on from that, if an employee refuses to reduce their hours or pay, can we make them redundant?
You have to undertake a restructure process, and you can't disadvantage them simply because they refuse to have a variation to their terms and conditions of employment. So if they're one of 3 or 4 workers doing the same job, you're going to have to involve everybody and undertake a selection process, and refusing to have a variation won't be a criteria that I would say you'd be able to use. So if you have to reduce costs, then, and if everyone's not playing ball, you're going to have to, undertake a restructure process. Again, it's quite specific for business to business, but we are here and we're able to help you with that.
Thanks, Matt. We've got some great questions coming into Slido, and can I also remind participants that you can also vote up the questions if you see one there that you're particularly interested in. On that subject, and I know we've had this question in the past, if the business receives the wage subsidy, when then distributing payments to employees, does it have to go to all employees, or can the business prioritise those people that are most affected by the current situation?
The application that you make and the declaration you sign names specific employees, and it's an amount per employee that you have named on the application. You wouldn't be able to take some money from one person's part of their dough to the other. There's only certain circumstances where you can do that. For example, for part-time workers, where the wage subsidy is higher than what they would otherwise earn, you can take the balance and provide that to other people to top them up. If you're paying less than their full wage, or to support paying their full wage. But no, you can't just kind of divvy the money out that's in the bank account to particular people as you see as needed, because they're in difficult positions. It has to be, the amount is for a specific person to subsidise their wages. Yeah.
Yep, agreed.
Paul, I might direct this one to you. With the current restrictions, can we discuss with employees to do different tasks over the next 2 weeks to get their hours without repercussions? For example, could those employees undertake an office spring clean, even if this is outside their normal job description?
I think I certainly understand the question, and I think in most cases employees would welcome that if they were going to get the same kind of pay. But having said that, you've always got to bear in mind that that is a unilateral change of their terms and conditions of employment. So I think if it's just going to be a one-off and a short-term thing, you're probably going to be all right. But if it's going to be more than short-term and become a regular thing, then that is a variation of their contract. I think also you have to bear in mind, while you may be doing this for the very best reasons for A, your business, and B, your staff, staff also have recourse to their advocates, and they might have a different view of that. So I think you need to think about who your staff are, what sector you're in, what kind of rapport you have with your staff as to how you do that, and take appropriate measures to mitigate any possible repercussions that you may have down the track. I think, as I said, if it's just a short-term one-off, probably not going to be a problem. But if it's going to become normal or normalish over a longer period of time, then I think you would need to seek some form of variation.
Yeah, and I'd say there's usually a clause in most people's employment agreements which outlines your duties are outlined in the attached position description, and you may be required to undertake any other duties as reasonably required by the employer. And I guess that gets back to Paul's point. Is it reasonable? And if you're going to require it, is it just a short-term change to deal with, it could be levels of demand or a whole range of things. If there's nothing to do and they're twiddling their thumbs, is it reasonable for them to, clean up their offices or start cleaning up and doing a spring clean? My view for a short period of time is yes.
I know certainly in the EMA's case, we've had to redeploy a number of staff onto other activities, and the staff have done that very willingly. But it has been a process where we've engaged with them and talked them through that process. So I'd encourage employers to take that approach. Got probably a question here regarding the leave subsidy from the 21st of August. Should we have employers use any current sick leave first and then apply for the COVID leave subsidy, or use the subsidy first? How should this work?
My view is utilise the subsidy. It's there, that makes sense. That way, the employee gets to potentially keep their sick leave balance. But if they do end up going on sick leave or annual leave, you're able to utilise that subsidy payment to subsidise their normal wages. So if you're eligible for the this new wage subsidy, the resurgence wage subsidy, then go for it. Absolutely.
Yep, I agree.
Got another one on the same subject around leave, but this time from a different angle. Due to COVID-19, our businesses had to redeploy staff to work in other areas in the same capacity. Some would like to work, but others are content to stay at home. Does annual leave come into question? And for those who don't want to work and have no leave entitlement, how do we deal with this?
There's a few questions within that question, but
where do you start?
Yeah, if a person doesn't want to come into work, I'd just be interested to know why. If they're not making themselves available to come into work and you're asking them to come in and they have no leave balance, then they would be on unpaid leave.
Yep. Because they have an obligation to be ready, fit, willing, and able, and if they are that, and you've got work to offer, then they are withdrawing their labour, and it's at their behest.
All right, thanks, guys. If you have staff that have resigned and will be leaving partway through the 2-week resurgence subsidy period, can you still apply for them?
The resurgence subsidy makes reference to the employer not being able to terminate an employee's employment, but an employee can leave at any time. So if they have a 1-week notice period, then if they're working that out, you can use the resurgence subsidy for that, and any balance I would suggest you would pay back to MSD.
Thanks, Matt. We've got a number of questions which I might just cover about the exemption process. So look, one of the issues that we've raised with government, based on feedback from a number of our members, has been the fact that for reasons that we certainly can't understand, the Ministry of Health made a decision that previous documentation that employers and their employees had been using in previous alert level 4 and 3 was suddenly determined to not be valid in this alert level 3. So a number of our employers and their employees had letters and material that previously pointed out that they were an essential industry, or that they were, entitled to move around. And for reasons that no one can quite explain, the Ministry of Health decided not to, that they required new assistance. Further exacerbating that has been for employers who have been contacting the Ministry of Health. They've been told that exemptions might take up to 5 to 6 days to be approved, which is patently ridiculous, given that where we are in the current planned alert level 3 period, by the time you get the exemption, we're probably about to come out of alert level 3. We'll certainly, fingers crossed, if we continue to stay on top of the resurgence. So those issues we have canvassed with government agencies and with senior ministers, and we are expecting that there will be changes to that system over the next 24 hours. It will potentially require a change to the order, and we're certainly pushing very hard on your behalf. The whole system is pretty broken, because obviously you've got police and defence force staff who are having to make decisions at the border without being able to consider previous documentation, with ambiguity about the exemptions, and also ambiguity about what services are in and out of the current criteria. So it's not a great situation at all. Many of you will have had employees who experienced lengthy delays yesterday, and that's frankly just not good enough. So we are working hard on your behalf to get that resolved as soon as possible. The issues are clear, but I think it will require a change in the order, or definitely some further clarification about the order and the process for getting exemptions in order to make this work. I don't know, Paul, if you or Matt want to add anything to that, but yeah, it's been, in my view, possibly one of the most unsatisfactory things we've had to deal with through the whole COVID-19 event starting back to March.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've heard examples of nurses trying to get to work from the Bombays and having to sit in traffic. They're 5 hours late for a shift, and then because they don't have the email from the Ministry of Health, but they've got their identification, they're not being let through and being turned around. It's completely unsatisfactory.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's again, that there's so many moving parts, and I don't think they really anticipated the friction that having 2 different lockdowns across the country, two different alert levels across the country with the border really posed. And I think it's a huge learning curve both for them and for us.
Yeah, dare I say it, having a command centre based in Wellington that probably doesn't understand that actually, there are a significant number of people that work in Auckland who don't live in Auckland, and Auckland is part of a regional economy, and so there are goods and services that are moving across that border. Some of that was covered in the original order, but a lot of it was pretty high level and probably not in the level of detail that people needed, and relying on an exemption system, which was clearly never going to be able to cope with the volume of applications that it's received. Yeah, not being the finest hour. And we know from the hundreds of calls that we've been dealing with through our business helpline and through the advice line, just the impact that it's having on businesses, many of whom are already struggling in this new environment. So we'll keep people posted around that, but we're on the case, and we're pushing hard around that. We're doing some media today around that as well, just to reinforce the position. But we know that changes are afoot, and that's pleasing to hear. Back to Slido. How does the COVID-19 leave support scheme work with staff already off work on ACC leave?
You wouldn't be able to receive both because ACC are paying for that leave, so they're not able to work. They're on ACC. So once they're able to come back to work, say tomorrow they went off ACC, you could then from the applicable date, I think it's the 21st of August, apply for the leave subsidy if you wanted, if they met those criteria that I mentioned, if they're in the high risk category or what have you. But you can't have two at the same time.
And Matt, presumably that also applies if an employee already has the wage subsidy, they can't get the sick leave subsidy as well until that wage subsidy is finished.
You can only be on one at the same time. So when your employee's wage subsidies finish, if you were on the original extension, that's when you can apply for the new resurgence extension for the 2 weeks, and your date of payment will be from the date of your application for the resurgence subsidy. Yeah, so you have to wait until you finish one before you apply for the other.
Okay, let's have a look here. We've got one. What should I do if I've had staff working from home during the first lockdown without a variation to their employment consented by them in writing, and now just have found out during this lockdown it is required?
Well, Paul can answer this one probably. I mean, I'm happy to. I mean, you probably didn't need a variation for people working from home. It's only where you're changing their wages and things like that.
Yeah, if they're working from home, then ostensibly they're doing the same job. It's just a different location. So that, I think I'd agree with Matt there. But if you're changing other conditions of their work that are substantive, then I think you may have problems.
Yeah, and when I mentioned place of work before, it might be that you have several outlets or several centres that you're operating from, and you're moving an employee from one to another, and their employment agreement says that they're actually only working in, a particular distribution centre, for example. So, but for your average Joe, who you're just saying, hey, look, you can work from home, jump on Teams and do your work on the laptop, that's fine. You won't need a variation for that. I mean, you could it'd be helpful to get an email from them saying, yep, happy, that's fine. But yeah, it's not totally essential. There's no disadvantage there.
Yeah.
Got a question here. Can we apply for 2 times 2 week periods?
No, you can only apply for under the criteria of the current resurgence extension. Well, because it's only 2 weeks. Yeah.
Okay. I've got a question here which I think I can answer, which is there any subsidy for employees who live in Pokeno and who are therefore unable to attend work? They're not an essential workplace. I mean, you would have to apply, for that if you achieve the wage subsidy, the resurgence wage subsidy threshold. So there isn't a particular subsidy available for those workers. So you would have to meet the criteria of the wage subsidy to be able to deal with that. Hopefully, with the changes that we're trying to push through on the border, we will be able to get through some of that. But yeah, it is very tricky given the number of people who live outside of Auckland and come to work every day. Couple other here from a previous question. If that employee is withdrawing their agreement to work when they do not like the alternative work available, what do you do? Would you go down the abandonment track?
Wouldn't be abandonment. Abandonment only applies where you don't know where they are. That's hence abandonment. They're missing in action and they're not in contact with you. If you're in contact with the person, you won't be able to utilise abandonment clauses. What it would be more a case of, if they're refusing to come into work, it could be a failure to obey a lawful and reasonable instruction to come into work when they're able to. They're also in breach of contract because they've signed up to work a certain amount of hours each week. So it's more of a disciplinary type situation. And you'd have to, obviously really check the facts and go through a proper process as to why that they were withdrawing their labour and not wanting to come in before you took any disciplinary action against them. Again, part of the full and proper process.
Yeah, and can I just add into that, Matt? I think you're absolutely right, and I totally agree with you. I think also we've got to look at the union's position on this, and they really want to see employers behaving properly and very fairly and above board. So going through a very proper and open and transparent process with all the due inquiries and conversations would be paramount.
Thanks, Paul. A long question here, Matt and Paul, so bear with me. It's quite a specific example. An employee unable to work under alert level. So this business is open. They've got an employee unable to work under alert level 3. The business was advised that they don't need to pay as they are open and work is available. They're waiting on a medical certificate from that staff member, but paid the first day in good faith. Use leave entitlements, and now that staff member is on leave without pay. Is that okay? This business is not 40% down, so they're not entitled to the leave support or the wage subsidy.
Yeah, so what I get from that question is the person is sick and is unavailable to work because they were waiting for a medical certificate from this particular person. So if they've exhausted their entitlements, they would be on unpaid leave. Yeah. And depending on how long that goes for and what the nature of the condition is, we'd be looking at potential medical incapacity. If it's months down the track and they're still ill, or a month or two down the track, you'd be having those conversations around prognosis for recovery, when you may be able to return, that type of stuff. Paul, do you have any?
Yeah, I think in those situations, given we've got the kind of cloud of COVID over us, it does make it a wee bit more cloudy. But I think you need to be talking with your staff member about not so much what the detail of the condition is, but agree on a possible when they're going to return to work. So you're both working towards a goal rather than just leaving it open-ended. Also, if they've also got annual leave and they have no sick leave left, then they can request any for that payment.
Paul, just on that subject, from this question, as a general rule, we don't utilise leave without pay, as this would affect the holiday calculations down the track. How would we deal with this in principle?
Oh, that's a difficult one here. Look, I think you'd need some real good advice on that, and probably Matt or one of his team would certainly be better to answer that one. I think if you're following all the right principles and doing it correctly with consultation, you can't go far wrong. But doing the actual calculations with the Holidays Act, that's another paradigm entirely. And we hope to see that clarified with changes to the Holidays Act when and if it comes out. Matt?
Yeah, I think what that question, I think what they're asking is that they've got a system where effectively they require people to use any leave available to them. And they don't use leave without pay as part of their processes because it affects the calculations within their payroll system. But again, you can't require somebody to take annual leave, for example, unless you've been through a process and given 14 days notice if they decline. So you can't simply say, oh, look, our policy is you must do this. You actually have to run through, because the requirements are in the Act and you can't contract out of statute.
Yep.
All right, I'm conscious that we're getting to the end of the allotted time, but we'll just cover a few questions. We've just had a few coming in thick and fast. One of the questions about exemptions, we're trying to get some answers about how long they'll take at the moment. We're hearing 4 or 5 days. I think one employer was quoted 7 days, which is clearly not satisfactory. So we'll keep you posted around that. Just look out for our social media, and now COVID-19 EMA site for an update on that. We'll advise you as soon as we know. We have got a question here. How long does the leave support cover an employee absence? E.g., they cannot return to work due to being at risk, and let's say level 3 potentially continues for longer.
The leave support, I've got it here. Please excuse me. Where are we? That will cover, sorry, bear with me, the period of the wage subsidy that you've applied for, my understanding is. So if the person is still unable to work and they meet the criteria under the leave subsidy, that will continue, my understanding is, until the subsidy stops.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matt.
But they still got to meet that criteria.
And can they apply for the leave support scheme for staff already on long-term sick leave? These staff would meet the high-risk classification.
Yeah, again, it's around talking with the staff. I mean, if they are not able to come into work because of one of the criteria, and as I said, they're at high risk if they could get COVID if they came into work. They've come into contact with someone with COVID-19, they've tested positive themselves, or a household member is at higher risk. You have to meet that criteria. So if they're sick for some other reason, then no, you wouldn't be eligible for it.
Okay, and I'll make this our last question. This company has applied for an exemption under Schedule 1 of the Civil Defence Emergency Management Act to get a crew into Auckland from Waikato to fulfil contract obligations. They currently have half the company kicking stones around the yard in the Waikato, obviously waiting for approval. Do they qualify for the resurgence subsidy for this time? The answer would be if that has a 40% impact on your business.
You have to meet your criteria.
Yeah, you have to meet that criteria. I mean, it's another reason why we're trying to get the exemption and the border sorted out as quickly as possible, because clearly the pain point is for businesses who can see that the issues with the border are going to create an impact for their business. But if you're in that delta, the delta, let's say between 20% and 40%, it's pretty tricky in that space. And we pointed that out to the government in the discussions that we've been having with them around that 40% threshold. And obviously, any evidence you've got around impacts that maybe are not at 40% but are still significant for business, keep that feedback coming to us via our social media channels and via email. Any of that material is good. You know, it helps us build a body of evidence, if you like, to raise with government agencies. And certainly over the last few days, the feedback we've had around the border has been very useful in just pointing out how restrictive the conditions are. And as Matt talked about earlier, you know, people waiting in the queue for 4 hours, then getting to the front of the queue and being told, sorry, you can't come through. Just completely unacceptable situation. So that's very useful. Can I thank Matt and Paul for being on the webinar today? And can I assure members that we'll continue to, as there are any substantive changes to Alert Level 3, we'll use webinars and tools like this for keeping you apprised of what's going on. Please feel free to use the business helpline and the advice line. We are getting, you know, huge volumes of calls, so I ask for your patience in that regard. And obviously, we're pushing material out to members and to the wider business community as quickly as we get it. We wish everybody well in their endeavours to get through alert level 3, and fingers crossed that we'll get some joy around the domestic border issues over the coming period of time, and just keep those questions and feedback coming in. Thank you, everybody.